Hello and welcome. Today I'm back with another Lightroom tutorial and I'm gonna take this raw file and I'm gonna turn it into a photo like this, while of course explaining every single step I do. In this tutorial I really want to highlight the local adjustments, especially the adjustment brush, Radial filter and the graduated filter. So today I really want to highlight what I usually use these for with my landscape pictures and really give you a good understanding of how I use them in combination and where I use what tool. This is the raw file from a path on the Quiraing on the Isle of Skye, and I really like this, angle, how the path leads you into the picture, and I think there are so many different possibilities to make local adjustments here and really make some areas darker, add contrast in some parts and make other brighter. It's really gonna be very much depending on the local adjustments. But before I start with the local adjustments, I still have to edit the picture with the global adjustments. I am only going to use the basics and tonal curve in this case. Now all of these other tools, they are great and you should definitely take advantage of them, but they don't tend to have such a big impact on your photo, it's more like detail stuff that you only really gonna notice when you print your picture for the most part. So the basic and the tonal curve adjustments are definitely gonna be the most impactful in all of Lightroom. So let's get started here. I wanna go for a relatively dark mood, so let me actually bring down the exposure a little bit. It really works well in this case. And usually I like to bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows, but I really don't think it works for this picture. I really want to preserve this very dark and moody look. So instead of bringing down the highlights, I'm actually just gonna leave them at 0. And in terms of shadows, I might just bring up the shadows a little bit, so I can bring the contrast slider to the right. In your global adjustments, you don't really want to go too far with any adjustment, you just want to build a nice base to work upon with the local adjustments later. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of contrast here. The whites, I think I'm gonna bring up the whites to at least get a little bit of dynamic in the picture. And blacks, I don't really think I'm gonna work with the blacks too much in either way, because if I bring them down it really makes these shadows too dark in my opinion, and if I bring it up it kind of makes the whole picture a little bit too flat. So I'm just gonna leave that there. Temperature slider is of course another very important thing to change and play around with. Instead of going for the neutral whites, especially in landscape pictures or cityscapes, I would go for that what looks the best. Now I really like this kind of warmish look, but because this is such a dark and moody picture, I actually think sort of a bluish tone works even better, because it really amplifies this dark and almost sort of unpleasant mood. So I think that works a lot better. Tints, don't really think I have to adjust anything here because there's not really any color cast in any way, so I'm just gonna leave that at default. And then clarity is another very important tool and can definitely have a huge impact, but once again don't go too far because you just want to build a nice ground base to work with later with the local adjustments. So I'm just gonna add maybe around 25 clarity here. And in terms of vibrance and saturation, if you want to change any of these, I usually change the vibrance because it adds and decreases color a little bit more naturally looking than the saturation slider. So even though this is a very dark and kind of moody picture, I don't really think that bringing down the vibrance actually works all that well. Yeah, instead I think I'm actually gonna amplify the vibrance by just a little bit and make everything just a little bit more colorful. Then tonal curve down here, a thing that I love to do is just bring up the highlights, and especially here in the sky you will see how much more dynamic and how much more lighting you get in the whole picture. And I like this look quite a bit. Then the other sliders just usually play around with that, really knows a tactic. and just stick with whatever works best. You don't really have to go quite as far into the minus and plus. With these sliders I found, really a little bit into the minus or a little bit into the plus is usually enough to see what it does, and I rarely change anything more than just a little bit. So let's finish that up here. And last thing, point curve. Here you can change the kind of very fine contrast in your picture. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it is just a little bit too much. So in this case, I think I'm just gonna leave it at linear. So as I said before, there are a lot of global adjustments that you could play around with, but since this tutorial is mostly about the local adjustments, I am gonna say that I'm done with the global adjustments here, and I'm gonna start with the local adjustments. Quickly, let's see before and after. This is what we started with, that's the after. You see, it works a lot better for the mood, and we already managed to kind of create the overall rough look that I am going for. So let's continue here. First thing I am going to do is grab a graduated filter. Graduated filters are pretty much the roughest local adjustments that you have. They affect a very big portion, and I would use it whenever you want to change a very big portion in your picture or a whole side or something like that. So in this case, and in pretty much all of my pictures actually, especially landscapes, what I like to do is just grab a graduated filter and make a very soft edge, and you see here the light is obviously coming from the top right here, so I just want to kind of amplify that and go into the plus exposure just a little bit, and that way you really create some more dynamic in the picture. You could also mix that with, for example, plus or negative clarity, whatever you like better, or even try to add maybe a little bit of warmth in the color right here. And actually I might try to just add a little bit of orange, and you see before, after, just a little bit more lighting. But then you can grab even another graduated filter and just drag it in pretty much the parallel of the previous one, and this time go into the minus exposure just a little bit. Once again, you don't want to do something like that, but just a little hint of minus exposure, and that way you get to amplify the lighting scheme even more. So here's before any graduated filters, and here's after. You see really how it works with the overall lighting scheme. Before, the foreground was just a little bit too bright, and the whole exposure was a little bit too even. So after, it really works a lot better with the lighting. Another thing that graduated filters are really great for is for very rough vignetting. For example, if I just wanted to make, an entire side a little bit darker and add some vignetting there, that is a great way to do it. And maybe I'm actually gonna do it on the other side as well. And you're not gonna be able to really control it that well. So I really just would suggest you to do that if you want to add a very rough vignetting and not really fine tune anything. But I think it works in this case. And even other thing that you at least could try out with the graduated filters is to grab one and just kind of drag it over the bottom and go into the minus exposure, and that way you really can sometimes even exaggerate the whole lighting scheme even more. And if you do it with a relatively small one, you can sometimes, close out the picture, and that can actually work very well in quite a lot of the cases. You could do the same thing with the sky as well. It actually really works sometimes to really just kind of close out the picture. So you see, I actually think it works here for the sky. Let's just see before this one graduated filter, and here's after. So you see, it's just kind of a little bit more differentiation, and your eye is more contained within the picture. This closing out part is definitely not something that works all of the time, but I think it's worth to at least play around with. So I think I'm done with the graduated filters, really amazing tool, and let's see what it's done to this photo before after. I mean, it's an absolutely huge difference already, and you see how we pretty much, made the whole lighting scheme look a lot more natural and a lot better. Once again, before any graduated filters, and here is after. So after the graduated filters, what I usually do is just add some dodge and burning. Now, dodge and burning is making individual parts brighter or darker, and I made a very in-depth tutorial about that already, link in the description. But today I really want to focus on the actual what I look for, how I amplify the lighting, how I make stuff more interesting with it. So let me grab a Radial filter here, and first thing you want to do is just kind of look at the scene. So you see pretty much the entire portion right here is relatively evenly lit, and the whole picture, even though we've, added a lot of dynamic and interest with the graduated filters, it could still use a little bit more, especially in the middle part, in the path, and you really exaggerate the natural lighting. So in this particular case, I think I'm just gonna add a very big Radial filter right here. Always want to make sure that the feather is to 100, and then I just kind of want to go with the lighting scheme. So you see the light is kind of coming from here, going onto the path, going along this side, not really going to the left. So I really just want to go with that and bring up the exposure and maybe even the clarity a little bit as well. And I might even add a little bit of orange and just make, this part with the plus exposure a bit warmer to once again get even more differentiation between the plus and negative exposure. So first, you just want to fine tune the exposure. You definitely don't want to do something like that, but just a little bit, something like this works pretty well, I think. And then you just want to fine tune the actual position of the filter. And by the way, because we have the feather at 100, the actual effect is really way smaller than it looks like. When I go here into the minus exposure, you see only really the very center is really affected by the exposure adjustment. So let me go back here into the plus exposure. And I think that actually works really well. I think that looks really good with the overall lighting scheme. So let's just see before this one Radial filter, and here's after. And you see how amazing it is and how much it changes the whole picture. I might have done just a little bit too much clarity and a bit too much exposure. Now, I don't really add a very big Radial filter just like this one in a lot of my pictures, but I think it works for relatively flat pictures just like this one. So then I am grabbing another Radial filter and just a very small one, and just go plus exposure with this one as well, and add a little bit of clarity. And you just want to kind of add some smaller Radial filters as well, and just drag it over the portions where you think it could use a little bit more plus exposure. So once again, really just amplifying the whole lighting scheme and making everything a little bit more interesting while still keeping it looking natural. For example, maybe this little thing, just adding a bit of exposure on the top here. Right click duplicate, maybe here could fall some light on. You really just want to go with the lighting scheme, you don't want to go into the deepest shadows and just add a ton of plus exposure here, because that would not look natural. But if you just go over the kind of flat spots, or where you just want to amplify the plus exposure a bit more than there already is, I think that's an absolutely amazing way to do that, and you can create a lot of dynamic with it. So you see, I'm just making some stones a bit brighter and really creating some more additional interest. Right click duplicate, and maybe a last one over here. So let's quickly see before these plus exposure Radial filters, and here is after, and you see it's a lot more dynamic, and I think it makes the whole picture look a lot more interesting. But once I am done with the plus exposure Radial filters, I always add minus exposure Radial filters as well. And with the minus exposure, it's just like with the plus exposure, you just want to drag them over the parts where it's already kind of dark and in shadow, and just bring down the exposure even more to kind of amplify these very small spots. Then right click duplicate and drag it to another spot where you think it could work. Now, you don't really want to do very big minus exposure radial filters because I really don't think it works all that well. If you want to do additional vignetting, I would do that with the adjustment brush in a little bit. But you know, just with the radial filters, just kind of going over these small parts and making that a little bit darker, and really maybe even mix it with contrast and add a little bit more interest once again to the whole lighting scheme. I'm not gonna go too far and too in depth into it, really just wanna keep this video as short as possible. Also, just bringing them in between the plus exposure can also work and really help to give some additional interest, additional sort of contrast to your photo. Let me just finish up here. And maybe one more over here, and let's quickly see. I think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do. So let's see the photo before any plus and negative exposure radial filters, and here's after. So you see it adds a lot of dynamic, and after adding the minus exposure filters, it also really helps to give some contrast back to the whole scene. Then the last adjustment that I usually do is with the adjustment brush. Now, I don't really use the adjustment brush all that much. The only thing I pretty much use it for is for additional vignetting with minus exposure, of course. And I really like actually the adjustment brush for very large areas. So for example, if I wanted to make this whole side relatively dark, I think the adjustment brush does a great job of that. Just for very small adjustments, I don't really like it all that much. I much rather use the radial filter for that. But just for some very broad and very big areas, the adjustment brush does a great job. So in this case, I just want to add a little bit of vignetting to really amplify the mood once again. You can also press down the Alt key and you get the minus exposure adjustment brush, and that way you can paint over and remove the effect with the adjustment brush that you already previously added that was kind of too much. Maybe a little bit more over here. And yeah, if I press O here, you see it's not really that much in this case, but you definitely get the relatively organic overall vignetting with the adjustment brush, and you wouldn't really get these kind of shapes with the radial filters. So let's see before the adjustment brush, of course, before, after, just a very tiny difference in this particular case, but it's still a noticeable difference after all, and in quite a lot of my pictures that are maybe not as, dark. I really love this tool, the adjustment brush, just to add a little bit of vignetting. So I think I'm actually done with this picture, so let's as always go into the history and see where we started at. This is the before, and you see it's very flat, the raw file, really no contrast, not really any interest, no differentiation in exposure. And here's the after. I think it works a lot better and it looks a lot more interesting and really dynamic. So I hope you found this video helpful, where I mainly concentrate on the local adjustments, the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush, and hopefully you kind of got an idea what I use these tools for. Once again, really love the graduated filters for very broad adjustments, to make an entire half of a picture brighter or darker, or to add very broad vignetting, or just to close out the picture. And I use the radial filters for very relatively small adjustments, except in some cases where I just, for example, want to make the middle of the picture a lot brighter, which is something I could not do with the graduated filter, and just amplify all of these dark spots and also the bright spots with plus exposure and so on, and then use the adjustment brush just for some additional vignetting. So I really hope you could take away something from this video and really, get an idea of how to complexify the lighting scheme and how to add dynamic in your picture. Actually, if I go here into the history and just look where I started with the local adjustments, and I think this is before any local adjustments, and you see, this is really just the local adjustments, the difference, and it's really huge. So you see the massive impact that local adjustments can have to your picture, and I think local adjustments are one of the most important tools that you have in Lightroom, besides maybe the basics adjustment. If you've enjoyed this video and you learned something from it, then be sure to subscribe for more videos just like this one, other Lightroom guides, Lightroom tutorials, landscape photography edits, all kind of photography related stuff. And I've been sick the past couple of days, so that is why I couldn't upload any videos, but I'm definitely feeling better and I'm able to talk again, even though my voice is not really at its normal state quite yet. Anyways, I hope you all have a great day, take care, and of course keep taking awesome pictures.